Tori, one of the first criteria that you might expect from the Concord Coalition is whether or not budget deficits are going down in every year of the budget window. What do we find here?
Sure. I'm going to give you the classic Washington answer on that one. And the answer is, well, it depends on how you're evaluating. When you look at deficits on a pure dollar basis, then no, absolutely not. Deficits are not going down. We've got, deficits are rising every year. And deficits are also in excess of $1 trillion in each year of the budget window. So that in and of itself is daunting. Another way to look at this, though, is deficits as a percentage of GDP. And deficits as a percent of GDP, they're definitely smaller than they were, during the pandemic, and they bounce around a little bit. So right around in the 4.5% range. Some years are higher, some years are lower. So when you look at it from that perspective, deficits are not necessarily higher. But then I'm going to caveat that answer and say that when you're looking at deficits as a percent of GDP, and you've got a really robust assumption when it comes to GDP, then obviously your deficits are going to look smaller. So that sort of leads me to turn to Steve and say, okay, are the projections of GDP, overly robust? Are they rosy, given what we know about today's economic climate? Because obviously, if we've got really robust projections of GDP, then a debt to GDP ratio that looks stable is probably inaccurate. And so I would probably say then, probably not. Deficits on a dollar basis, but also as a percentage of GDP, are not going down every year. So.
Well, Steve, why don't we turn to you then on that? Because, as Tori mentioned, any budget is really built on the economic assumptions that are going into it. And one of our criteria is whether the economic assumptions in a budget are plausible. What do you think?
Yeah, the short answer is no. The longer answer is it's complicated, as Tori was suggesting. So, when they were putting the budget together this past fall, interest rates were lower and inflation was lower, and therefore the outlook looked a little better. And so by the time the budget came out, basically this time last year, interest rates on government bonds, 3-month T-bills or 10-month government bonds were all below 1%. This, a year ago today, basically. They're now, the 3-month is up to about 0.5%, the 10 years up to about 2.5%. And, obviously the government has a huge $20 trillion debt. So the higher interest rates go, the more expensive, the more costly it is to pay interest on the debt. But the president's budget, and inflation, of course, back in the fall was about 4%, and it's now almost close to 8%. So there's been a huge change in both the inflation rate and in interest rates. That's not reflected in the budget. In other words, they basically assume there will be a 4 or 5% inflation this year, and by next year, 2023, inflation will be back down to the Federal Reserve's target of about 2%. Now, technically, there's a difference between the Fed target because they use a different measure of inflation and what's typically cited in the budget, which is the CPI. But roughly, the budget, because it's based on last year's numbers, was before the war in Ukraine and before some of the other continued supply shocks we're seeing around the world. They've vastly underestimated inflation. They've also, as a result, vastly underestimated interest rates because interest rates and inflation ultimately are tied together. So, the near-term outlook is probably much rosier in their budget than it will be in reality. Now, only time will tell whether the Fed is able to contain inflation as quickly as the budget assumes. But in the long run, the problem, of course, is they're assuming real GDP growth of 2.3%. Now, that doesn't sound extraordinarily high, but the problem is the economy has been changing over the last few decades. We've been seeing the population age. We've seen a decline in immigration, and we've seen a decline in productivity growth. And basically the components of real economic growth are productivity and labor force. And if you look at the estimates, for example, of the Congressional Budget Office, their real GDP growth is less than 2%. And so, as Tori suggested, if you inflate your real GDP growth numbers, then you can make your debt look more manageable because you're assuming the economy is growing faster, and therefore the debt is shrinking relative to your economy. But I think by most, private forecasters' assumptions and by the Congressional Budget Office assumptions, 2.3% is, on a sustained continuous basis, which is what the president's budget assumes, I think is overly optimistic. And it makes a big difference. A 1% higher GDP growth rate is about $3 trillion over a decade.
Mhm.
So we're talking real money when you assume a higher GDP growth rate than what may actually